Hi folks, Chuck Black here. We're doing 52 weeks of Python. We are in week number 52, and the topic for this episode is YAML. In general, we're looking at ways you can represent data for transferring it between entities. We're looking at JSON and XML and CSV and YAML. And so today's topic is YAML. We are going to be looking at how you read it or convert it from YAML into Python data and how you change it back in the other direction. We'll even look at how data gets, how YAML files get used within Quokka as kind of a real world example. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so let's start to talk about YAML. You can see I have it highlighted here. On this slide, we were discussing earlier, starting last week, how you go from something like this, which is data stored in Python in a bunch of objects, since we know in Python everything's an object. How do we take that and translate it into something that can be sent across a wire effectively between two processes, two applications, two servers, across the internet, etc.? How are we going to do that? And we looked at JSON, and one of the nice things about JSON is that it's both human readable as well as computer readable. If you were to go back even before XML to my early days, the way that we transferred data was completely unhuman readable. Everything was stored in a binary manner. We eventually migrated to something like XML, which is human readable-ish, but it's pretty verbose and things get lost. You know, you gotta parse through all of the angle brackets and figure things out, etc. And JSON, pretty easily, I can just glance at this and see what this is, see all the information. Even less verbose is YAML in this format. And so this is what we're going to be talking about, how we do this in Python today. So just even looking at this, you can kind of see that a dash is going to be representing items in a list, and that colon with the key value is going to be representing dictionary type data within YAML. And so that's what we will be looking at. So here's a better example of, oops, this is my JSON. Let's go down to the YAML stuff. That might be of more interest since we're talking about YAML. So here is the YAML version of this Python data. So here's my entire Python piece of data that I've niftily fit into this little window, this little box. And here is the version of the same thing in YAML. As you can see, it's short and concise. The nestedness is represented by indentation. The square brackets for a list in Python is represented by items beginning with a dash. So here are two of these different devices in the inventory. The dictionaries are represented by key value pairs on either side of a colon. In YAML space, white space, especially at the beginning and near the colon, is important. You need to make sure that you do your indentation correctly. You can choose the amount of indentation that you want, but you have to be consistent, just like with Python. So whereas with, in fact, you can kind of see this here with JSON, what we were looking at just a second ago. I'll go back to it right here with JSON. White space, etc. lines, you can pack everything into one line if you want, because you have these nice square brackets and curly brackets to tell you when the thing that you're looking at begins and ends. In YAML, it is not that way. In YAML, we have the normal default representation looks like this, and that in this situation, indentation and line breaks and stuff are important. So you need to make sure that you honor that. And as we go through this, we'll see a little bit more about different ways that you can represent YAML that make it look a little bit more like JSON, but still pretty concise. Another thing that you'll notice, what do you see a lot of over here on the left that you don't see any of, I don't think, over here on the right? And if your answer was quotation marks, you're absolutely correct. You do not need to specify quotation marks. YAML is smart enough to figure out that, hey, this must be a string here. And looking at this, oh, that's a numeric value, so it must be an integer. If we had Booleans, it would be able to figure that out. If we had floating point numbers, that would be a number with a dot and some more precision after that. YAML is able to figure that out, so it does not require quotation marks in the same way that JSON does, and certainly Python does. And one thing that I will point out, and this is true for YAML as well as for JSON and other stuff, what I'm giving you is a taste at the very top of the tree of what you need to know to get started with YAML. If you want to go into details about all of the different aspects, you can Google it, and the things start out pretty straightforward, but then they get pretty complicated with funky little notations here. So you can do a whole bunch of different things if you want, but I'm giving you the basics in what we're talking about. So that is a really quick overview. The next thing that I want to talk about is how you read and write data into and from YAML format. So looking at the terminology, in Python, of course, we have a dictionary and we have lists. In YAML, the word that people tend to use for a dictionary would be key value pairs. Sometimes they actually use the word dictionary, but key value pairs would be what they would tend to use as well. And then a list, similar to the way that JSON calls it an array, it's called an array in YAML. Now, how do you get data from one format into the other? In other words, from Python data into YAML format, or from YAML format into Python data? Well, just like with JSON, it's from the perspective of the Python program. So you would be loading things into Python, you would be dumping things out of Python. So that's how you remember which is which, the dump versus the load. Now, you'll see that there's a dump function very similar to what's available in JSON. So you can do a dump and it will convert it into YAML format for output. What's the deal with this safe underscore load, you may be asking? Well, in the early days, you could just do a load, and so then it would be pretty symmetrical, load and dump, very similar to what you have with JSON. Why do you have safe load? Well, the answer is in the YAML language itself. The actual language and the definition, the specification for what you can do with YAML is actually many times greater and longer than it is for other data serialization specifications such as JSON or even XML. And so what that means is that you can do a whole lot more with YAML potentially than you could with some of these other data-only formats. But what you can do, and that gets YAML into problems, is you can theoretically put into your code, into your data here, not into your code, you can embed something that is executable into the data. And what would happen when you ran load, the load function from the PyYAML package that we use, it would actually execute that. Now, from purely a functionality and technology, etc. standpoint, you can imagine the coolness of being able to do that. But if you have security bones in your body, then you're probably saying, hang on, you should never be able to do that. You should not be able to execute, you should not be in a situation where you could potentially be executing a program that is given to you by some other third-party entity. It's the same thing with databases and the injection of scripts which can actually run on a database server. The danger of that, there's a similar danger here. And so YAML created an alternative load function, and if you try to use load alone, then PyCharm and other aspects of Python will squawk at you because they'll say it's not safe. Somebody could inject some type of executable that would result in bad things happening on your system. So we use safe load, and that prohibits the YAML library from executing any script or anything that might be embedded in the data. That's a high-level view of it anyway. So YAML, we do a safe load and a dump in order to pull the data into Python and to put the data out into YAML format respectively. So we'll be looking at this a little bit later, but just so you have a general idea, you may be saying, is YAML used at all in this Quokka thing that Chuck built? And the answer is yes. YAML is used quite often in configuration files. If you're familiar with Ansible, Ansible playbooks are written using YAML format. And so I have used YAML as the definition language for representing devices, compliance, services, workers. Can't remember if there's anything else that I have in there that's in YAML, but that all gets read in at initialization time and then of course stored in the database. So I do use YAML, and we will look at that towards the end of our discussion here. So let's have a look at the code here that I wrote. Over here on the left, we have the YAML example, L02 YAML example. Over here, I have L01 JSON example that we went through in the last episode. And if you were to look right down to this point and compare this, what I've highlighted, with what's over there, you would see that it is 100% identical, except for the fact that I have changed from JSON over here to YAML over here. And of course, I've named things YAML whatsoever, but I'm doing YAML.dump. Over here where I did JSON.loads, then over here I'm doing my safe load of YAML. But the things that I'm doing and even the comments are identical, and I'm hoping that I made sure to change JSON to YAML in all of my comments as well. So up to this point right here, everything is identical. And just this morning, just a little while ago, I added a little bit more because I wanted to demonstrate something that is possible in YAML. If you're a fan of square and curly brackets, that is possible. But let's look at what we did, and to not belabor things too much, I'll assume that you've gone through this before. I won't spend too much time. So what are we doing? We're going to basically use inventory. Remember, that's this file that has all of the information about these devices that we actually use when we end up talking with those devices. So I'm going to take inventory, import it, and then I'm going to convert that inventory, which is in Python format, into a YAML format. And then I'm going to just write it out. This is just a regular, there's nothing in this that I highlight right here. There's nothing YAML-ish about it. There's no YAML code that's getting called. It's just a regular writing of a text file. I happen to name the file YAML out just so I'd remember what it is when I look at it. But that's the only thing. It's just the name of the file. I'm just doing a regular file write. And since we are in a project that I did at one point anyway, named files, then that's appropriate, and I'll give myself a little bit of leeway to do that. But this right here is purely writing text out. This right here is the YAML part. So this is where the magic happens. We're taking Python data structures in inventory, and we're creating a string. We're doing a dump of it into this YAML format. And if I was to go here and say, okay, well, let me see what that looks like, then the actual YAML out is going to be this right here, and I'll print this out when I run it. But this is my inventory changed into YAML format. Now you will recognize that because that's exactly what was in the slides before. All right, my YAML example. Now the next thing I'm going to do to show that it works both ways is I'm going to read it in. And remember, if you remember this from the JSON discussion, how much of what I've highlighted here has to do with YAML? And the answer is absolutely nothing, other than the fact that there's the suffix YAML, which has no meaning. It's just a suffix in a file. The name of the file I called YAML in, but I could have called it Fred or X or whatever. YAML inventory is just the name that I chose to give it. It is just a string. And in fact, when I do this and I print it out, you'll see there's still no YAML. It's just that the string is in YAML format. I'm going to get rid of our JSON example, and I'm going to run our YAML example right now so that we can look at it. I'm also going to get rid of this so that I can make this a little bit more readable. So let's go from the top here. This is our printing out of the YAML file, and you can see I didn't do a very good job of this because I should have put at the end of this, I should have put a \n. In fact, I probably have that bug in the JSON one as well. Let's do that so that it's a little bit more readable. Okay, here we go. Looking at this file, this is what it printed out. Notice the printing added a space for me, which I really didn't want, and I could get rid of, but I'm not going to do it now because we don't care about that. But you can see this is the contents of the file that we just read in. Now this is what I did before. Remember, we had to unpack this in the JSON discussion, but I'm assuming that you'll be able to figure this out. Starting from the inside, I'm going to take YAML inventory, which is a string that has data that looks like this, and I'm going to do a safe load. So that's that load that I was telling you about that does a safe load of the data, and so if there was anything executable, it would throw an exception if there's anything dangerous in there. So it's going to do YAML.safeload, so that will take this string and put it into Python format. And then what do? I turn right around and I put it back into a string format. So this is just testing. Really, I'm taking a string, changing it into Python data, changing it back to a string. And if I have problems, it would end up throwing an exception or something. And I do print that out. And here is the pretty version that it prints out. And I've done a better job of formatting that for you because of my indentation equals 4. And I'm doing a separate statement for my print of this stuff. So here we see the Python data that's been read in, and now it's been written out. And the last thing that we do, similar to what we did with the JSON data, is I'm going to compare what I wrote out. I'm going to read it back in again. I've already done that. That's in YAML inventory. I'm going to change this. Remember, safe load is from the perspective of Python. So I'm going to load this string, which is what you're looking at over here, and I'm going to convert it into Python data. And if you recall, we went through this with the debugger in the last session, and we actually looked at all the different nested lists and dictionaries and lists and all the other stuff. And then what I do is I check what the saved inventory and compare it with inventory. What's that? That's the original thing from right up here. That's way up in this L00 inventory file that we save and that we never touch or do anything to. So I'm comparing what I've read in, written out, read back in, and now I'm comparing that to make sure that it's the same. Now, let me ask you this question. Wouldn't there be an issue potentially with respect to indentation, etc.? This is a trick question. Indentation in YAML is important, but once we get it into the format of being a Python object, which has lists and dictionaries, etc., is indentation an issue? It's not an issue, is it? It's all been consumed and written into this Python object structure. So there is no indenting, there's no white space or new lines or anything like that. And that's important, as we'll see when we look at an alternate way to do this. If I go down here, the good news is that this worked. The saved inventory equals the original. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense and you have a general understanding of what we did. It's exactly the same as what we did with the JSON stuff in the previous episode. So I think I'm not going to go through the debugger for this right now because inside in the Python structure, it's exactly the same. Okay, so here's the new code that I added, and you may be asking, why did you add this new code? The reason I added it is because, as you can see, I have this inventory formatted file, and I've actually changed this and called it the alt formatted YAML file. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, here's the normal way that you specify things. This is how you do a list. You do all the dashes, and this is the way that you do a dictionary item. You have a name value pair. Well, did you know that it is possible to use our good friends, the curly brackets? And so here you can see I've actually modified the file so that it is using curly brackets rather than being on a different line. See how the credentials down here are on a different line, but up here the credentials are all in the same line. And I could have done the same thing up here with our arrays or lists, and we will look at that. But what I wanted to do was this. I took the inventory that had been written out and I modified it like this. In fact, I've got mismatched spaces, so let me clean that up just a little bit to get rid of that space. So what I've done is I've just condensed onto one line the dictionary that had password and username in it. And so now the dictionary is all on one line, and I'm using curly brackets. Well, isn't it nice that everybody tends to use the same special characters for the same thing? And the answer is yes. It's very nice that it does that. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to read in this formatted one. I'm going to store it in the inventory alt. I'm going to print it. That's what you see over there. And then I'm going to do my safe load of that data and compare this alternate formatted one with the actual inventory that we started with. And these two should be the same. So I'm going to run this again. And here we see I got rid of that annoying space. Here it printed out what it read in. That's nothing special. But here's the important thing, is the alt formatted inventory turned out to be exactly the same as the original inventory. So I'm comparing this against the original inventory, and the only difference here is that I've used this inventory formatted file where things are formatted differently. So this is showing you that yes, you can actually do things differently. Now, in my experience, most of the time people have done it like this, but I think certain print functionality, perhaps in Python, when you print things out or in the YAML library, will dump things so that they look like this in certain situations. It didn't happen in our situation. Our original situation, it dumped it like this with my regular credentials when it did it normally. But it is possible to have it do this alternately. And in fact, that's what I'm going to attempt to show you at this point in time. Okay, I kind of hashed around trying to figure out what the actual parameter was that I needed to pass in, and it was the default flow style equals true. That is to my YAML.dump function. When I do that, it actually printed things. Look at this. This looks a little bit more like Python or JSON, and what it has done is it has replaced all of my indentation, this stuff right here that you see. It's replaced all of that with square brackets for the list of items, and then for every dictionary it's got curly brackets, and you can see nested dictionaries, etc. This actually didn't print it very nicely. I'm not sure. There may be other things I can pass in to the dump function to make it print nicer, but this is just showing you that yeah, it is a possibility. So if you get to a point where you see probably something that looks like this and you say, hey, wait a minute, You can't do that. You're mixing up your JSON with your YAML. In fact, it's true that in YAML you can use curly brackets and square brackets if you want in certain situations to denote your key value pairs or your lists slash arrays. So it is possible to do that. And now I'm going to put this back to the way that it was so I don't end up with it there before. And when I run it, you can see it printed things out in the manner that you would expect right here. Okay, so let's talk about how Quokka uses YAML files. We mentioned it's for reading configuration, and it's done during initialization. So information about devices, compliance services, workers. There's also information about the different monitors or remote workers that we have for port scan and for traceroute and for packet capture, etc. And these are all read in at initialization time in Quokka. Now, you don't need to understand or be particularly interested in Quokka, but just to see a little bit about how these YAML files are consumed and used in the real world. So I mentioned it happened at initialization. If you've gone through the Quokka walkthrough, we're going through the initialization phase during initialization, which is what this code is for, this Python module. I'm doing a number of imports here, import devices, compliance, services, workers. You probably imagine that we'll be reading YAML files associated with that, and that's true. I won't go into every single one, but let's look at import devices. If I go to import devices, which is in this file called APIs, I pass into it the file name and the file type, and what we're going to do is something similar to what we've just seen. Basically, I'm going to go to the appropriate location with the file name. In this case, it's going to be devices in Quokka data, etc. And I'm going to open it for reading, and that's this, I'm going to call it my import file. Now, I have structured this so that I can read either JSON or YAML and pass in that information. In our situation, we're passing in YAML, and so we're going to come here, and this looks familiar, doesn't it? YAML, we've done that before. .safe load, exactly what we did before. Now my import file is actually the file name that I passed in, which in this case is going to be devices.yaml, and I do a read. So here the result of this is going to be a string. It is going to be my devices.yaml file, and I'm going to do YAML safe load, and that will get put into this devices Python object, which is going to be a list of devices. And then all I do is, this is where I convert it into the database and save it in the database. I'm not going to go into that right now, but this is actually a Python object. So let's look at devices.yaml to see what we're consuming. Here you can see something that I don't think that I mentioned is you can put comments in your YAML file with a #, similar to what you do in Python. Here you can see that my devices file is going to be at its root a list of all of these different devices. Now here is my definition of one device. If you look at this, things will look kind of familiar to you. The name of the device, I have information about the operating system. Transport is telling me how I'm going to communicate with that device. If you begin to think about this, you will say, well, that's a little bit different than the way that you did it in terms of how this YAML information is structured. It's different than what we looked at before. If you recall what we looked at before in Python 52 weeks, we were in files and we were looking at something that looked like this, this is the end result, is we had, I had a dictionary that's part of the device called SSH info, and within that I had another dictionary called credentials, and then I had password and username. So here I have 3 levels deep nested data structures, and yet in devices in YAML everything's just at the topmost level. Everything's just 1 level deep. And why did I do that? I did it because that's how I store it in the database. While it's fun to play around with nesting of data structures and see lists of lists of dictionaries of lists of dictionaries, etc. In the real world, sometimes that meets with the way that you store it in the database. And frankly, when we store things in the database, all the data tends to get flattened out. This is what one would call flattening the data. So it's all basically right here, whether it's going to be information about SSH particularly. There may be information about down here. Do I have some netconf? Here I have netconf stuff as well. So yeah, we tend to flatten it out when we're using a database. Of course, you don't need to do it that way. You can have a different type of database and store things in a more structured, nested manner, but this is just how I did it. But getting back to the actual code that did it, very straightforward. I'm just doing a safe load. It takes all the stuff we were just looking at, puts it into the Python structure called devices, and that allows me to then go out to my database and store everything into the database. Hopefully that gives you an idea of how I've used all of these, the YAML files that we were looking at under here, under Quokka, data. You can see compliance devices, port scan monitors, services. If I was to just briefly go through these, you can see this one is pretty short and sweet. Services, there's a number of services, how I've defined those. Workers, these are my remote workers that I may or may not be using. Capture monitors is short as well. Yeah, you kind of get the idea. Devices was probably the more interesting one. So yeah, this is YAML data that we read in and consume and convert it into Python for storing in the database. Hope you know a little bit more about YAML now that you've seen it actually in action in a functioning piece of code that actually does something and not just one of the little trivial examples that I write for our Python 52-week stuff. All right, time for our quick review. We were talking about YAML in this episode. YAML is represented something like this. It's very simple, easy to comprehend. It's concise, much more concise than even JSON is. You use dashes to indicate arrays, items in an array. You use a colon with a key and value on either side to represent dictionary or key value pairs. You can nest the data. We also pointed out how if you wanted to, you can use square brackets and curly brackets to represent the data, but this is how it is typically done. We then looked at the code and we looked at an example which was very similar, at least for most of it, up to this point or so. Same thing that we did with JSON, where we read in where we got the inventory, which is in Python, and we wrote it out using dump, and then we read in, this is reading in the actual text, and once we actually wanted to do something with it, we used safe load in order to read it into a Python data structure, and then we compared what we had read into what we originally got from the Python file and made sure that it was okay. And here is where we just looked at an alternative version that actually had curly brackets instead of having the indentation and that way of formatting it. And so this is what it would look like. I just took this one dictionary or key value pair thing and used curly brackets instead. And we saw how that worked. Then I talked a little bit about how we read in devices and a bunch of other stuff using YAML files in our Quokka application. And we showed how easy it was to do that. You just do a safe load of the file that you read all the text for, and then it's in a nice Python data structure, which then allows us to store it into the database. So that's what YAML is. That's how you access YAML. That's how I used it in the real world, and hopefully you have a little bit better knowledge of how to use YAML in your own Python application.